Good day, everybody. Zack here with RevZilla, and welcome to another episode of Daily Rider. On the show today is the Kawasaki ZH2. That is a 1000cc supercharged motorcycle that weighs about 530 pounds and costs around $21,000. In a lot of ways, it's just another big, upright, fairly comfortable, extremely fast motorcycle. There are a lot of them in the world these days, but it is supercharged. And that little complexity adds a lot to the way that the bike sounds, to the way that it rides, to the way that it's perceived by the rest of the motorcycling world. So on the ride to work today, we'll talk about supercharging, the good parts, the bad parts, and of course, how it works to get to work. Buckle up, everybody. Here we go. Alrighty, everybody, before we get going on this ride on Kawasaki ZH2, a quick reminder that this episode is brought to you by RevZilla. RevZilla is not just a YouTube channel that you are watching, but also an e-commerce platform, a store where you can buy apparel and accessories for motorcycles and people who love them. So the next time you need a helmet, jacket, gloves for yourself, or you need tires, saddlebag, tank bag, whatever for your motorcycle, if you spend that money at RevZilla, a little bit of it goes into producing programs like Daily Rider. So that's the whole message. We appreciate you watching, and let's get going here. All right, everybody. This is the 998cc inline 4. In many ways, it is extremely conventional, but it has this supercharger here. You can see the branding is fairly prominent, and that's because Kawasaki's awfully proud of all of the research and development and money and brain power that went into putting a supercharger on this engine. And of course, we'll talk about how it feels and how it sounds later on, but that is the basic structure. It is an impeller supercharger system and forces more air into the combustion chamber than you would get with a normal airbox, and therefore you can add more fuel, and that makes more, that's right, power. So we'll get to that a little bit later, but that is a basic rundown of the engine. The skeleton is this very bright green steel tube trellis, which I think is kind of cool. And the rest of the structure of the bike is fairly conventional, really. You got upside down fork and a shock, and they are electronically controlled damping circuits, which we will talk about in the dash a little bit. Typical kind of high-spec stuff for high-spec motorcycles these days. Brembo calipers, which is not typical for Kawasaki, but on the high-performance models that Kawasaki has, some of them have Brembo calipers, and steel-braided lines, and radial pull adjustable caliper, all the sort of stuff that you'd expect to see on a bike that costs more than $20,000. Couple other things that are a little bit less conventional on this bike. One is the exhaust system, which does not have this massive bread box collector underneath. It just has this little bulb, and then a lot of the equipment for emissions and whatnot is actually contained in the actual muffler. But this is a little bit more, I don't know, almost retro at this point, to have a big muffler at the back and a slightly sleeker exhaust system that runs under the engine. Another thing I kind of like about this bike is the asymmetry of the front end. The airbox Raymer has this intake on the left side, so it's like a little wider on the left than it is on the right. Neither here nor there. I just think a little bit of asymmetry is cool. I always like the first generation BMW S1000RR with the wonky headlights and the different gills on different sides and stuff like that. Otherwise, standard brake sizes and wheel sizes and tire sizes and architecture of the bike. It's fairly standard in most ways. The really interesting stuff happens when you ride it. So let's get to that, shall we? Fire up this little TFT screen here. It's a pretty standard issue for Kawasaki, and we can switch on the supercharged engine. Yep, sounds like an inline 4, right? Because it is. Once we spool it up a little bit, you'll start to hear the little exotic bird chirp of the supercharger blowing off extra pressure. All right, everybody. I think we're ready to go here. You can take note of this pretty narrow passenger perch for when we talk about passenger accommodations. But that's a while yet. We got some riding to do before we do that. So let's ride. Right, now that we're rolling, we can start talking about specs before it's too late. Quick. This motorcycle with a full 5 gallons of gas in the tank, weighed in on the Daily Rider scales at 533 pounds. So it is a hefty chunk of machinery, and we'll talk a little bit more why later. I don't think Kawasaki technically claims a horsepower number from the 998cc supercharged engine, though the number that's thrown around most of the time is around 200, I think 197, something like that. Maybe that's what the European website claims, I'm not certain. Point is, it's very fast, which we will experiment with a little bit. The most important number is one that Kawasaki claims, which is the maximum torque, which I think is 101 foot-pounds or something like that. And to put that into context a little bit, mainstream other 1000cc motorcycles, your BMW M1000R, your Yamaha R1, your Kawasaki ZX-10, they'll probably make around 75, 78, 80 foot-pounds of torque, something like that. So it is a pretty significant jump in torque for a bike with a 1000cc engine, and that's all because of that supercharger. The seat height, I believe, is listed at 32.7 inches maybe, which I think it feels a little lower than that, but 32 inches is kind of middle of the road, so it's a little bit above what I consider basic average seat height, which makes sense because it's an advanced motorcycle, and Kawasaki probably didn't feel like they need to appease very many people with a low seat height, so they didn't bother. As for what it feels like to sit on, as you'd expect, I think. I don't know. What were you expecting? Were you expecting it to feel upright, comfortable, reasonable, but sporty? Well, then, yes, as you were expecting. I don't think there are a lot of surprises in the riding position. The seat height does not feel especially tall from, when you're at a stoplight or something like that, I don't think. But the foot pegs feel a little lower than I always expect on this bike, which I think is good. It sort of like errs on the side of comfort for a bike that's not truly designed for leaning over performance, as we'll discuss later on. From the standpoint of a typical daily ride, it's a very reasonable place to sit. Wide between the knees, but otherwise, yeah, it's fine. It's good. The thing that's maybe underappreciated about the ZH2 is the roll-on power, which we'll experiment with a little bit right now. That's fourth gear at not very fast and opening the throttle. It just pulls really hard. And does it make a lot of power up top? Yeah, absolutely. And the mid-range is super rich also, but it basically feels like a bigger engine than it is because it has that supercharger that's slamming air into the engine at an unnatural rate, and therefore there can be more fuel, and it just pulls harder than an average 1000cc engine. There's no two ways about it. It reminds me of riding a Hayabusa or a ZX-14 or something like that. I'm not saying that it's identical, but that's the kind of vibe that I get. When you roll on the throttle, it just has this thrust that you're like, whoa, that's more than I was expecting. And it's fun. For lack of a better word, it's really fun. As for the ZH2's manners, riding like this, pretty reasonable, I think. All the responses are good from the chassis. It's sort of big and heavy, but that feels appropriate when you ride down the highway. It doesn't really matter that much. The riding position's pretty comfortable. It's got cruise control, and it has electronically controlled suspension, so you can loosen up the damping and kind of make the ride a little more plush if you so choose. So in general, quite an agreeable bike for stuff like this, aside from not having wind protection, but like, whatever. You weren't expecting much in that department, were you? No. I actually got a fair number of questions about touring capabilities and, day rides or weekend rides or longer distance, whatever, on the ZH2. And I think that's intriguing because obviously to some extent Kawasaki's marketing worked and people are under the impression that it's upright and comfortable and reasonable, and it is. But also it has that sort of whiff of exotic flavor with the supercharger and all the stuff that comes with Kawasaki's Rivermark, I suppose. All that is to say, it holds 5 gallons of gas, and at its core, it's a fairly reasonable, kind of understated engine. It's just a 1000cc inline 4, and if you ride it like that, you might see fuel mileage in the, I would say, mid-30s to upper 30s. If you really want to feel the fury of the supercharged engine all the time and really get on it, gas mileage will dip down into the 20s, which is pretty bad, but also almost feels fitting, right? Like, I don't want a motorcycle to be wasteful. I don't want to, send more noxious fumes into the atmosphere than we need to. But when it comes to a machine like this, it almost feels appropriate, doesn't it? That it would burn a lot of fuel. That's like what it's designed to do. That's the novelty that is Kawasaki's H2 lineup. It's about burning more fuel than you need to, just to get more power than you had before. In a lot of ways, this environment is the one that the ZH2 is most comfortable in. It sort of feels the most regal and understressed, and it's nice and smooth. The mirrors are good. It feels higher quality than a lot of other bikes. I think Kawasaki leaned in and tried to make it feel a little bit higher quality than its other bikes and other bikes in the class, because it felt like it was special and deserved it, and I think I can feel that, and I like that. The only thing that this environment doesn't really serve is rolling on and off the gas, which is the most fun thing to do with this bike. At the end of the day, though, this might be the environment where it's the best, which is an odd truth, I suppose, but there it is. Okie doke, into the neighborhood section of the route and the stop sign challenge, where we try to get footless stops. Oh, yeah, okay, we got it. In general, I will say that this is not the environment that suits the ZH2. The supercharged engine, especially early generations of the H2 sport bike specifically, not the Z model that I'm riding now. I remember the throttle response being really bad. It was so difficult for Kawasaki engineers to get the fueling correct and make it easy to ride in these scenarios. The ZH2 is a lot better. I think it's quite reasonable, actually. And the clutch feels good. It feels like a high quality piece of equipment, because it is. I think it does pretty well to acquaint itself with this type of riding, even though it's not really at its heart what it wants to do. Ultimately, the ZH2 is swimming against current, right? I mean, it's a 533 pound motorcycle that's not especially low or especially accommodating. Its saving grace is that it's high quality. All the sort of feel that you get from the throttle, from the clutch, from the brakes is high quality. That'll make it a treat to ride for experienced riders, and experienced riders are probably the only ones that should be riding this bike if I had my way. So yeah, it does pretty well. I would say it does better than I would expect, considering the type of bike that it is, especially, like I said, having experience with the previous generation H2, which was the throttle response was pretty bad, and it felt kind of unaccommodating. All right, green light. We can goose this engine a little bit, see if we get that supercharger chirp. So the overall round town review, I would say the ZH2 is surprisingly subtle, I guess, considering what's lurking inside it. It's quiet and tame and reasonable, especially that there's that unnatural thrust on tap when you want it. All right, we'll do a quick pop back onto the passenger perch here. And the passenger perch is pretty bad, actually. Surprisingly bad, I would say. You know, that like sort of whiff of extra quality that I talked about? It's not even a lack of quality in the passenger accommodations. It's just all of a sudden feels very, very sporty. The passenger perch is stiff and narrow, and the legroom is pretty bad. It's not that I'm surprised by that or dismayed. I think it's just that, considering there's the H2 SX sport touring bike, and Kawasaki has an outlet for that kind of thing, I guess I would have expected the ZH2 to like lean a little more gently into passenger accommodations, because it's the kind of bike that if a passenger gets on, they'll have higher standards than most. But no, maybe I misjudged that. If you have a ZH2 and you want your passenger to be impressed, you better hope they have buns of steel, so to speak. Ooh, nice juicy footless stop there. Alrighty, into the Twisty Road section of the daily rider route, and I'm going to go from road mode to sport mode. I said I'm going to go from road mode to sport mode. Come on, do the thing. Oh, I'm doing the wrong... Is that the wrong button? That's wrong. See, there's two rocker switches, and I got confused. Alright, now we're in sport mode. We can be sporty. This is an interesting piece of the ZH2's personality here, because is it pretty good at going through twisty roads? It's got ninja DNA, blah blah blah. Yeah, sure, fine, but it is not what it wants to do. It's quite heavy. It's a little bit, I won't say cumbersome, but you got to kind of like push on the handlebar to get it to go where you want it to go. It's not ultra neutral. The suspension is pretty widely adjustable from a damping standpoint, but ultimately is sporty in a good way for a road like this, but is not going to change its personality very much. depending on the type of sport riding you like to do. It doesn't take much of a twisty road to reveal that the ZH2 is not really a classic sport bike or naked sport bike. It's in a different category. It's not the same kind of athlete, if that makes sense. Now, to be fair, it also doesn't take much twisty road riding to appreciate the fun of the supercharger and the engine and all of that really surprising, satisfying power on tap. Like if you're on a road, I'm stuck behind traffic here, but if you're on a road, a second or third gear, and you're kind of like accelerating and then braking into a corner, you can hear the supercharger go chirp, 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 chirp. And then you come out of the next corner and you kind of open the throttle a little bit and get the boost up. It's really fun. Ultimately, I have to say that the engine can sort of overwhelm what it feels like the bike wants to do pretty fast. Sport mode also reminds me a little bit more of that throttle response that I remember, where it's like pretty sharp on and off. And oops, I turned on my high beams. And I prefer road mode. It also reacts a little bit better, I think, when you lug the engine. Between 3,000 and 4,000, it's like pretty sweet around town, I think. If you start running the revs up to 5,000 or 6,000, that's where the hit is a little bit harder, which is pretty typical with modern fueling. So I guess I can't condemn it too much for that. Right, back onto surface streets. Off we go. One of the really fun things about this engine, I think, and maybe this is sort of digging more at the core of what I like about it, is that inline four-cylinder engines often need to be revved to get any joy out of, They need to be up close to 5-digit revs before you feel like, wow, I'm really like getting the most out of this engine. And something like Yamaha's MT-10, I think, is a step in the right direction. It has different firing order in the engine, and it makes a sweet sound, so you're sort of like more enticed and interested in the rev range. Sorry, in the mid-range. But this takes it to another level. It just makes so much more power so much sooner than you expect, and it makes it a unique experience and really, really fun. All right, we're going to start in second gear from this red light here. I'm just going to let the clutch out and open the throttle a little bit here. And we're doing a wheelie already. Oh, a yellow light. So we can talk about two things. First being the brakes. Let's jump on these brakes, shall we? Yeah, really good brakes. Really good. You want really good brakes when you have 530 pounds and 200 horsepower. And this bike delivers. Next thing I was going to talk about was the dash. Who's it? Which is, like I said, pre-standard issue Kawasaki. Starting to look a little dated and a little small, especially for a luxury machine like this, in my opinion, but it works nicely. It's got a big bar tachometer here. See if we can hear that supercharger. The little boost gauge was kind of fun. It tells you where the where the supercharger's at. And then the rest of the stuff's all pretty basic, right? I'm trying to think what can you adjust in here and change. Oh yeah, so you can cycle through, see some IMU data, which is kind of fun. Not that lean angle I think is going to be a super important metric on a bike like this, in my opinion, but there it is. And then some fuel mileage stuff and range and useful things like that. Let's see what else. You can also, if you hit the select button and hold it down, you go into this menu where you can access other things if you would like. The usual kind of mumbo jumbo in a dash like that. And then the last little trick it'll do, I think, let me see here. You hold this button down. No, that's not doing it. You can change the background color. Pretty sure. Maybe I only know how to do it when I'm in my custom rider mode, as opposed to wet or sport or road. Or you can see the the adjustable stuff in rider mode. You can adjust the power, the traction control setting, and the Kawasaki electronic suspension. You can make some pretty specific adjustments, which is good because it's a fancy bike. If you're paying for fancy suspension on a fancy bike, you should be able to make lots of adjustments, which I think is appropriate. All right, well, this is part of the ride where we talk about whether or not you'd buy this bike just for the engine. And you can probably guess what my answer is for the Kawasaki ZH2. Yes, absolutely. The engine is the reason to buy this bike. Full stop. The rest of the bike's nice. Brembo brakes are nice. The TFT dash is nice. The cruise control is nice. But lots of bikes have that stuff. A supercharged engine is unique to Kawasaki's lineup, if not this model line, or this bike specifically. And it's special. It feels special. It sounds special. It feels a little odd at first, but I never get sick of the noise of it. It feels a little weird to like recommend what's ultimately a gimmick, because you don't need all the horsepower that it delivers, but it's fun, and fun is what motorcycling is about. So the good, the bad, the daily for a supercharged motorcycle. Well, I mean, the good's pretty obvious, right? Like I said, it's unique, it's awesome, it sounds cool. All your friends are gonna go, whoa, no way, which is fun. Riding it's fun. You know, genuinely has more torque on tap than a motorcycle with the same size engine that doesn't have a supercharger. So that's like a pretty obvious gain there. The worst parts about it, it's heavy, it's unnecessary. But, you know, unnecessary is not something that I'm gonna get too upset about in motorcycling, because let's be honest, the performance gains of running a supercharger off the engine, sapping horsepower to make even more horsepower, is a bit of a bizarre thing to want, I guess. But because it's so rare and this bike is so unique, I feel like it deserves credit for doing something that others don't. You don't need the horsepower, and you don't need the jazz hands of having a supercharger on your bike on your daily commute. But there's a certain thrill to it that I think has to be tried to be appreciated, and that will always hold an interesting and special place in my heart. I think it's cool that Kawasaki did this ultimately, silly as it is. All right, speaking of silly, let's take this sucker down a dirt road, shall we? And yeah, this will be an interesting experiment. So we're in KTRC 1, which I believe is the most lenient traction control. Let's try that. And we got the suspension set to soft, you know, for a dirt road, obviously. Yeah, so the way that it reacts when you open the throttle is strange and not very good. And I think, but if you're more gentle with the throttle, you can actually get some decent acceleration. It basically overwhelms the system when it spins up too fast, which happens with a lot of traction control systems. But now I'm going to shut it off, see if I can. How do we do that? We do this. Yeah. Now I have KTRC off. And I think what we're going to find here is that ooh, it spins up really fast because the supercharger sort of compounds itself and makes the revs rise even faster than they would naturally. And it's the kind of thing you have to get used to from a power delivery standpoint. And if you're going to shut off traction control, it's also something you need to get used to. Okay. And this will be pertinent in our little wheelie test here as well, because I don't think it's an especially easy bike to wheelie. It has plenty of horsepower to wheelie, obviously, but I don't find it especially easy to control. Let's try it. Oop. Can't you see? Come on, buddy. Here we go. Whoa, there we go. Yeah. Very, very not easy to wheelie. And that's because of the supercharger. It's a bike that I appreciate the traction control even more so than usual, because it is once the revs come up and you have to control either with the rear brake or with the throttle the actual input that you're getting as you get to the balance point of a wheelie, it's really tricky. So I leave traction control on because I like that it just sort of, or sorry, wheelie control and traction control on, because it's so powerful, and because when you get those little wheelies that it sort of carries a couple inches off the ground, I find that really satisfying anyway. And it's just a big lump to wheelie, and ultimately the supercharger throttle response does come back to bite you in those situations. Okay, we were stymied a little bit by the electronics the last time we tried to do the wheelie, so let's just give it another try. We're going to be a little smoother with the throttle here. There we go. God, it's fast. Holy Moses. Woo! Can you back it in? Not here, that's for sure. We got a little traffic jam here. ABS is not as adjustable as I would like to see from a bike like this, but I kind of get it at the same time. Like, what are we doing with like shutting off ABS on a 500 and something pound motorcycle with all this horsepower. Not sure I'd subscribe to that anyway. You can get little back-ins if you drop the clutch, and there we go. But it's not ultimately a hooligan bike in that sense anyway. I'm really intrigued by the stabbing the throttle and it not wheeling. I think it's got like an electronic control there so you don't mousetrap yourself, which is fair because holy heck, is there a lot on tap. Lots of parking spaces here today, everybody. So we got plenty of room, which we might need with this beastie. So we're gonna go full lock left, feet up, and we're gonna go, yeah, I mean, what, two and a half parking spaces is, I would say, about right. All right, there you have it, everybody. A ride to work on Kawasaki's super duper charged ZH2. Let's listen to that supercharger one more time, shall we? It's pretty fun. Like I said, it's quite a novelty, and it's quite a project. It's quite a thing that Kawasaki did to create this thing, honestly. It's wild. Okie doke, time for some of your questions, everybody. First up is 903 Liu, who says, what amount of extra maintenance should be expected with a supercharged bike? This is a good question, and I did not know the answer. I did a bit of research. First up, right off the bat, a supercharger is an extra piece. It's another thing. It spins to fantastic RPM, 130,000 RPM or something like that, because of planetary gears that spin off the crank and slam that air into the intake. The point is, it's another thingy spinning around. It's another moving part, and it's very specific and has really tight tolerances for how much lateral play it can have and stuff like that. There isn't really a lot of extra maintenance that Kawasaki suggests, as far as I can tell from the manuals that I saw. Some owners have taken to checking the lateral play themselves, which you'd want to be a pretty confident mechanic, I think, to do that or mess around in there. At least, I'm not sure how confident I would be, but that's the important thing to keep in mind, is that it is more complex than a regular motorcycle, and if something happens to it, it'll be another expense, and so there's that. But the sidebar caveat to that is that Kawasaki doesn't seem to expect that you need to do a lot more maintenance on a basic schedule than you would with another motorcycle. Another interesting piece that I found was a lot of commentary on online forums and threads and whatever, that dealers are charging more for maintenance for this bike than other bikes, even if it's basic maintenance, even if it doesn't have anything to do with the supercharger, because it's an expensive exotic bike. And there were some people that said that they had to kind of hold their dealers' feet to the fire and, you know, ask them why they're being charged all that money. So there seems to be some kind of nuance and some tricky things to navigate when it comes to maintaining the bike, whether it's yourself or paying a dealer to do it. Ultimately, it shouldn't be a lot more complicated. It doesn't have an intercooler. It doesn't have some of the things that supercharged engines historically have. It's, I think, relatively simple and compact as an extra piece, but it is an extra piece. So something to keep in mind. I hope that feedback helps a little bit. That's a great question. Next question is from Emmanuel TX, who says, does it fit with the other super nakeds in the category? Super Duke from KTM, Ducati Street Fighter, BMW M1000, etc., or is it its own separate thing altogether? Yes. Definitely its own separate thing. It's not razor sharp. It doesn't feel like really at home in tight, twisty sections of road. Like, what it wants is like gentle sweepers at 100 miles an hour, 120 miles an hour, where you can roll out of the corner and hear that supercharger scream and unleash this brute force. And of course, that doesn't exist in this world. And for that reason, it feels quite a bit different in those scenarios than all of those other bikes. Yeah, you should expect it to feel big and feel heavy compared to those machines, and also expect it to kind of like light your fire in a way that those bikes don't, especially in that sort of like low to mid-range RPM where it's quite impressive. Next question is from Matthias Harris, who says, would a smaller displacement bike with a supercharger ever make sense? Maybe in the increasingly popular 400cc class? I love this question. If you listen to the High Side, Low Side podcast, you know that Spurge and I have gone back and forth about turbos on motorcycles again and again. Supercharger's a little different than a turbo, obviously, but you know, it's in the same realm of forced induction. And I think there's something there. I know it's silly, but I think that there might be something there. I don't know. The bottom line is with motorcycles, it doesn't often make sense to put a turbocharger or supercharger on a machine because you can just make the engine bigger and you get a similar return with less complexity and less weight. Scientifically, does it make sense? No. But from a marketing standpoint and from an excitement standpoint, which is what motorcycling is, yeah, I think there's something there. Look up the Suzuki Recursion concept if you're not familiar with it, from 2007, 2008, something. I don't remember when it was, but God, that bike lit my fire. So cool. Parallel twin, turbocharged, potentially good fuel mileage, but then when you open the throttle it would hit really hard. I think there's something there. We'll keep working on it. Thank you, Matthias, for lighting my fire all over again. Last question is from Tato456, who says, how come I've only seen older gentlemen on the ZH2? Is it meant for an older audience? This is a fun question. Yeah, so part of it is that it's a $21,000 bike, $21,400. Did I ever say the full price? I don't know if I did. I think it's $21,400, although I have to look that up. So it's an expensive motorcycle, and people who have worked longer and saved longer often have more money, and so that's part of it. Also, older gentlemen, as you put it, might appreciate the sentimentality of this bike harkening back to the H2 of the 70s, the two-stroke 750 triple, and what that bike represented as being like crazy powerful and insane and amazing, and this lightning bolt and the shot across the bow of the industry. And in some ways, this bike has that character, right? It has a reputation for being insanely fast, because it is. And performance of motorcycles these days is just so far above what performance was like in the 70s that it's like hard to even compare them on paper. But like I said, the emotion is there. And I think the type of person who was 20 or 30 years old in the 70s when the original Kawasaki H2 was a thing and they were like, whoa, man, that thing's crazy. Now that person is a lot older. And maybe they buy this bike because they think, I'm not going to get an old two-stroke from the 70s, but I'd get a bike that represents that feeling. So I think that's a piece of it too. But, probably also the money thing. All right, everybody, that was fun. Thank you very much for sending your questions. As always, I had a batch of good ones. I just tried my best to pick the ones that were exciting and fun, but if yours didn't get picked, keep them coming. I so appreciate it. Stick around for just a moment. We're going to put this sucker on the Daily Rider leaderboard, and then I'll let you go. Hang on. Okay, everybody, here we go. Drum roll, please. We are at the Daily Rider leaderboard with Kawasaki's ZH2, which of course gets a little fire logo there and a dollar sign because it's spicy and pricey. Other spicy and pricey motorcycles you will see at the top of, or near the top of, the Daily Rider leaderboard: the KTM 1390 Super Duke, BMW M1000R in 3rd and 5th place respectively. A couple of things I want to touch on before we rank this Mamma Jamma. One, I want to circle back to the throttle response a little bit. I think I might have been a little bit muddy on that. One of the things that the Supercharger does is change the way the bike feels from a fueling throttle standpoint. It's quite different, and I think that it's important to remember that and take that away, because it's one of the things that I felt so much, and I want to make sure that that's clear. Another thing is the price. For 2024, there is the ZH2 SE ABS, which is the model that we rode right there. That motorcycle has an MSRP in 2024 of $21,300. In 2025, it is set to go up to $21,700, I believe. There is also a ZH2 non-SE ABS. It still has ABS, mind you, even though it's not in the name, but it does not have the electro suspension and a couple other features, and I think it's painted a different color to delineate it. Anyway, there is, for 2024, technically like an $18,000, something like that, ZH2 that's not quite as fancy as the one that we rode. And I did want that to be clear ultimately as to one of the reasons why I kind of fumbled on the pricing. And it goes up a little bit for 25, but so it goes. Okay, housekeeping out of the way. Where does it go on the Daily Rider leaderboard? We're deep into the year here, 2024, so the leaderboard is pretty thick with competition. A couple Kawasaki's here. Kawasaki Ninja 500 SE. The ZH2 is better than that. It's just more special, it's faster, it's more better. Kawasaki Z900 SE. Okay. Is a Z900 better or worse than a ZH2? To get to work, that's a pretty good bike. Next to each other in the garage, I'm going to take the ZH2 more often, just because it is special and it is supercharged and it's so cool and interesting and fun and makes a weird chirp when you get off the throttle. Though it does have some things about it that are not as good. It is heavier. The throttle response isn't quite as good, so on and so forth. So there's that. BMW M1000 Single R, also spicy and pricey. Similarly fast
you know, kind of exotic motorcycle. You could argue covered in carbon fiber and all the whiz bangs and doodads and 200 horsepower, and it's an incredible bike in some of the same ways that the ZH2 is an incredible bike. And I hate to give the nod to the M1000 because it's more conventional, but I think the performance that you can get out of that bike is ultimately more versatile, and the ways that it is special and good are broader than the ZH2. So I'm going to give the nod to the BMW. It could easily go here. It could easily go here. What do you think? Is it better than a Z900 SE and a Monster SP? Or is it worse because it's heavier and more expensive? It's so different. It'll make each ride to work exciting in a way that almost no other motorcycle can touch, and that includes an M1000 single R, you know? Like, same thing with the Super Duke, right? Super Duke just has all that torque and all that sort of like, I don't know, effervescence from the engine that is just so hard to describe and can really only be appreciated by those who have felt it. So I'm gonna put the ZH2 here, above the Z900 SE, which is in some ways a controversial pick because the Z900 SE is arguably a better all-around motorcycle. The worst thing I can say about that Z900, as usual, is that it's a little bit forgettable. And the ZH2 is not forgettable, and I like that in a motorcycle. The Monster SP, I'd rather take that to a track day, and I'd rather ride it around in a city, probably, even though it's hot. Yeah, I'm gonna stick with it. Let's just stick with it. Let's walk away from the board, call it good. I hope you're not too ticked off. I had a lot of fun on that Kawasaki ZH2. I hope you did too. Stay tuned for the next episode of Daily Rider, which will be episode 100. That's right, everybody. Something special coming down the line if all goes well. Stay tuned. Thanks again for hanging out. Ride safe. See you next time.
You gotta give me a thumbs up for my wheelies.